Well, we're back, ladies and gentlemen, and this time we're going to be talking about the decision-making process in a little more detail. Price elasticity of demand, we discussed, was a tool that we could use to get an idea of how consumers are going to react in a very specific situation. In other words, we change price, what are folks going to do? And this tool, price elasticity of demand, helps us understand how they're going to behave in that situation. So chapter 7 is that decision-making process from a little bit different angle. The first term you discovered in this chapter is utility. Now, utility is just a word we use to talk about the satisfaction that you and I get from the way in which we spend our money. The satisfaction we get from the Happy Meal I bought my grandkids today. The satisfaction I get from the new pair of shoes I bought. The satisfaction you get from filling up your car with a tank of gas. So utility is just a measure of satisfaction. Okay, and that kind of leads into a little bit bigger discussion in this chapter, which is the thought that we spend our money on those things that provide us some amount of satisfaction. And some things more satisfaction than others, but really we're just trying to spend our money in a way that makes us happy. I don't know, is that a good word for satisfaction? Hopefully that works for you. So at the beginning of this chapter, you see several different terms just coming at you in this barrage. Utility, total satisfaction, marginal utility, additional satisfaction, disutility, dissatisfaction, and all those leading up to a discussion surrounding the term, the law of diminishing marginal utility. And what it basically says is this: as you consume more of a particular product in a specific time period, the amount of additional satisfaction you get is going to go down over time. And you've lived this principle. You know what it's like. You had a really long week. You come home and you just want to forget about the world. So you turn the radio on. That first hour of listening to music, great. Brings you a lot of satisfaction. The second hour still makes you happy. You're forgetting about the crummy week that you had, but not as much satisfaction as that first hour. Well, you see a chart in the book that looks something similar to this, where they're talking about satisfaction, and they've got these measurements of satisfaction they call UTIL. It's UTIL. It's just a made-up word. That is a measurement of how much satisfaction we get from watching TV, playing baseball, whatever that activity might be. All right, so satisfaction is going to go down over time. Specifically, marginal utility, marginal satisfaction goes down over time. That's just the way it works, and you've known that forever and ever. Now, in the end of this theory, then, at the end of this chapter, we see in the appendix a discussion of indifference curves. And what it says is this: sometimes you can look at two different things and both would make you equally happy. You're really, really thirsty. You really don't prefer Coke over Pepsi. So you've been playing basketball. It's 100 degrees. You want a drink. If you can get a drink of Coke, you're happy. If you can get a drink of Pepsi, you're happy. If you can get a drink of water, you're happy. So you're indifferent. It really doesn't matter what you spend your money on. You're going to get the same amount of satisfaction. Now, I guess nirvana would be that place where, as we spend our money across all these different kinds of things that you and I could be spending money upon, we find that we get the same amount of satisfaction. Our authors discussed that as consumer equilibrium. Do you remember reading this, the equimarginal principle? They had this fancy formula in there. Looks something like this. Bear with me for a moment. So you saw this big, long formula in the book, and it had something like mu of A over P of A. They'll have that little letter down there. Mu of B, P of B. And what they're saying is, as we compare these ratios of marginal utility to price for all these things we could be spending our money on, the ratio comes out to be the same. For example, the marginal utility is always the top number. This marginal utility of this was 60 divided by the price, which was $30 for whatever that was. So the ratio is 2. marginal utility 40, the price is $20, the ratio is 2. So what we end up seeing is that it really doesn't matter what we're spending our money on. The amount of satisfaction we're getting to is the same. We would be indifferent. Or if we're getting that for every product, we would be spending our money in the way that gives us the greatest satisfaction no matter what we're spending our money on. Now, when you see these equations, ladies and gentlemen, generally there'll be this real long thing and it'll go dot, 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 dot. And that's supposed to mean the marginal utility over price for whatever number of things you can think of spending money on. All right. We hope we eventually get to that place where no matter how we're spending our money, we get the greatest satisfaction. For example, just something that popped in my mind. If we wanted to know how much a person was spending on a particular product and we knew that they were in consumer equilibrium, we know that the marginal utility divided by the price is going to be the same for every product out there. So if I knew the additional satisfaction they got was 80, whatever this thing is, but I don't know what the price is, I'm trying to figure out how much they spent on whatever that product is. Maybe it's a new laptop. That's a crazy thing for this example, but you get the idea. But I don't know what that is. If 80 divided by something equals 2, and it has to because they're in equilibrium, so top divided by bottom has to be 2 for all these things. If I don't know what that number is, I can simply take 80 divided by 2 and figure out what that price was. In this case, it's 40. So we can figure out what satisfaction they get or what prices are just by working with that principle of consumer equilibrium. If the person is in that position, if they're in a spot of consumer equilibrium. So read the chapter. It's interesting. At the end of the chapter, you'll find this discussion on neuroeconomics, and it's pretty cool. We can now look at the parts of the brain that fire while you're going through that decision-making process. It's kind of a neat thing. Hope you enjoyed Chapter 7. Let's move into Chapter 8. Chapter 8 then is a continuing focused look at what's going on. But instead of looking at buyers this time, we're looking at companies. And what we find is that companies behave in a very specific manner. My kids were very different, right? My daughter, when she was young, if there was a light on in the city, she wanted to be up. 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, she wanted to be up, wanted to know what's going on. That was just her style. Of course, she'd sleep till noon the next day. Now, my son would go to bed real early. You know, he'd go to bed at 7 o'clock, cashing in the chips, done. But at 5 o'clock the next morning, he's tapping me on the head going, come on, we got to go. Well, we see that same kind of things with businesses. We know how they're going to behave in certain situations. And you saw that discussed by our authors in terms of 2 concepts, costs of doing things and then productive activity of doing things. So our authors talk about costs at first, and they talk about cost curves. Lots of terms you'll pick up here. Get comfortable with those terms. Average total cost, average fixed cost, variable fixed cost. You'll see those in the book. Cost curves all behave the same way. Costs come down and then they go back up. That's just a function of the way they act. At the end of Chapter 8, you'll find this appendix. And in the appendix, it talks about production. And production is kind of like a mirror opposite. Production activity, when we look at those graphs, it goes up and comes back down. So very different, just like my kids. One was up at night and sleeps all day. The other was up in the morning and sleeps all night. Cost curves and production curves are the opposite. Cost curves down and up. Production curves up and down. So an interesting concept in here, the law of diminishing marginal returns. Sounds a little bit familiar, right? Like we talked about in the last chapter. It basically says this: as you add more variable resources, at first you can do more. Eventually you'll level off and then you can't do as much. It reminds me of the old saying, too many cooks spoil the broth. Our authors may have said that, I don't remember. The idea is this: at first, let's say you've got a business, and you've got a certain amount of room, and you add a person, you can start doing more. Then add another one, you can start doing more. Well, eventually, if you keep adding people, you get to the place where you've got so many people in there that they can't hardly move around. that's what happens. So at first you can do more, it levels off, and then everybody kind of gets in each other. At the end of chapter 8, then, we have this discussion about relationships, and specifically, I want you to get comfortable with the relationship between marginal and average numbers. And it works the same way, okay, you guys, it works the same way. Whether we're talking about marginal and average cost, or whether we're talking about marginal and average production, works the same way. If marginal numbers are coming down, they pull those average numbers down with them. If the marginal numbers are coming up, they pull those average numbers back up with them. So marginal and average numbers move in the same direction. Marginal numbers pull the average numbers in the direction that they're moving. Chapter 9. Just a couple quick snippets from chapter 9. It really is an introduction to the next 3 chapters, 10, 11, and 12. And so I'm going to leave it at this very brief part. Chapter 9 starts talking about these different selling environments that companies live within. And what you're going to see is a discussion of 4 different kinds of, some authors say market structure models, 4 different market structure models. And our authors talk about them as perfect competition, monopoly, monopolistic competition, and oligopoly. In our next video, I'll start going through some real basic characteristics for each of these markets. We'll talk about demand in each one of these markets. We'll talk about profit maximization in each one of these markets. But for now, just know this. Chapter 9 is kind of an overview of the next few chapters. Now, at the end of chapter, I can't remember if it's chapter 7 or 8, I've got you doing some math. I'm going to put some things on the board, and then I'm going to give you an idea of how to go through these computations. So again, bear with me for one moment, ladies and gentlemen. Well, in Chapter 8, then, we learned about these different kinds of costs. Things like fixed costs. Fixed costs remain the same no matter what you're doing with production. You make more, you make less, you're not doing anything at all. Fixed cost is fixed. It's a number that never changed. Variable costs change with the amount of production. If you're a car company and you make 100 cars, you need 400 tires. If you're a car company and you make 1,000 cars, you need 4,000 tires. So tires are a variable cost. Depends on how many cars you build. All right, so you've gone through these terms. I'm going to ask you to get comfortable calculating those costs. So let me walk through a problem similar to what you found in your written assignment for this chapter. You're going to have a bunch of information to fill in. Now, when you first look at this information, you may think to yourself, there's no way I can figure that out, right? How am I supposed to go and plug in numbers into those blanks? Well, let me help you work through that. So you see at an output level of 0, there is a cost, and this really is total cost. Let me tell you how I know. When you read about cost, you found that total cost is a combination of fixed cost and variable cost. Now, at an output level of 0, when there's $100 in cost, that must be a fixed cost. Fixed cost is something you have to pay whether you're making things or not. Here at the college, we have to pay for this building whether it's Christmas break or not, whether it's summer break or not. So whether we've got classes going on or not, we're paying for this building. Now, when you go from 0 to 1, you see costs go from 100 to 150. This must be total cost, although it doesn't say that up here. Must be total cost because now I've got fixed cost and I've got more in there. That must be a variable cost, things that change with different levels of production. So this is a total cost number. Now, let's see if we can start filling in some of those blanks. TFC, total fixed cost. I just told you fixed costs don't change, and we know that they are $100. So 100 is the number all the way down this column. TVC, can you read my handwriting, ladies and gentlemen? TVC, total variable cost. The difference between fixed cost, total cost, and total cost and fixed cost will give us total variable cost. So, no variable cost at all when we're not doing anything. Got it. Now we've got a cost of 150. If fixed cost was 100, the difference between these two will give me total variable cost. So 150 minus 100, 50 bucks. 225 minus 100 ought to be 125. Average fixed cost. To get an average, we're just taking a particular number and dividing it by the output level. So average fixed cost, nothing going on, so no averages. Fixed costs are $100. If we made one of something, 100 minus 100 divided by 1 is 100. Total fixed cost, 100 divided by the output level, 100 divided by 2, 50 bucks. Average variable cost, same deal. We're going to look at our total variable cost and divide by that output level. So 0 for that first number. Total variable cost, 50 divided by 1 is 50. 125 divided by 2 is what, 6250? Does that sound right, ladies and gentlemen? Average total cost. Again, we're going to take our total cost column and divide by that quantity of output. So to get at that first unit of output, 150 divided by 1 is 150. 225 divided by 2 is at 112.50. Last one then, marginal cost. It's just additional cost. How much did it take to make one more hat this day? How much did it take to serve one more meal? How much did it take to do one more thing? So we're going to work with that total cost column and just find the difference from one level of output to another to another. So at no output, yeah, no difference, you got that. From 100 to 150, that's the difference from 0 to 1. So that's 50 bucks. From 150 to 225, a difference of 75. Well, all right, that ought to give you a good look at that, and that wraps up our discussion of chapter 7 through 9. I'm going to step back and see if you can see all of that real quick. You still can, good deal. Work through this slowly, one step at a time. If you have any questions, get a hold of me. And in the meantime, do a good job on this assignment. And that's it for these chapters.